to incarceration. And Chris and I are going to touch upon some family aspects and how incarceration impacts families. I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on children and the hidden victims of incarceration, and I'll pass it on to Chris for a more thorough understanding of assessments and treatment with couples and families that are involved in the justice system. So starting with some jarring demographics, just to give you an idea, so 2.7 million children in the US have at least one parent in prison. So to say it in other words, 1 in 25 US children has a parent behind bars, and most of these children are under 18 years of age. So they are growing up in the most important developing years of their lives without one of their parents. And of course, it comes with, we know that the most common reported risk factors for incarceration is race, ethnicity, and social class. So recent estimates suggest that by age 17, 24.2% of non-Hispanic Black children and 10.7% of Hispanic children will have one of their parents behind bars. So effects of incarceration in families. Now this slide is pretty hard to kind of narrow it down to 3 bullet points, because we know that when one of our family members are behind bars, there's a whole array of problems that happen. But at its core, it alters family dynamics and support. It completely changes the family dynamic at its core. It hinders economic and social mobility for the entire family, depending on who the primary breadwinner was in the family. And it damages and severs parent-child relationship at a very basic level. So I'll be focusing a little bit on the children, and literature has said that children are the actually hidden victims of incarceration. And so I'm going to be sort of going down these bullet points, but we'll focus a little bit more on this idea, this framework called ambiguous loss. So initially, there's a lot of fear, embarrassment, and stigmatization for these children, especially in school, daycare, and other societal gatherings. But literature on this topic suggests that trauma and loss are significant themes that come up affecting these children. And because incarceration is not just one defining event, and the experience includes before, during, and after incarceration, these losses are very ambiguous and they're very difficult for the child to understand, and they change as the levels of incarceration prior, during, and after. So the ambiguous loss theory, studied by Adridi and colleagues, explained the framework and emphasizes changing and confusing family boundaries, unclear or falsified facts or vague reasons for the incarceration, increased family dysfunction given the nature of the multi-stressed environment. So depending on who the child is residing with when one of the parents is incarcerated, they get a slew of different explanations of what happened to the parent, when they're coming back, when are they going to visit the parent, are they going to talk to the parent or not. So these questions are never really answered for the kid, and they're just kind of left to figure it out on their own. And some of the times these kids are not even staying with a family member, and they're introduced to the foster care system, which becomes even more challenging and confusing for these children. Of course, the shift in caregiving also kind of stirs up abandonment issues, isolation, stress, and it then kind of trickles down to the child's relationship with themselves and with others. These then kind of go into the internalizing and externalizing behaviors. So then the child starts thinking about these guilt and the pain and the confusion, and they internalize it, and those internalized feelings kind of turns into hypervigilance and a lot of self-blaming and confused, ambivalent emotions. So there was a study done, it was a mixed method study, where they looked into quantitative data, where they found very strong correlation between the post-traumatic stress that were found in children who have lost their parents due to death, or have lost them due to very bad natural disasters, and they were very similar to the children of incarcerated parents. And one of the participants in the study, that one of the interviewee told the interviewer that, I tell him I miss him, I cry. Every time my father goes to jail, I feel like it's my fault. So this child, she was, I think, 10 years old at the time, and she thought perhaps it was her fault that the parent went to jail. So that was an example of one of the internalized feeling of guilt and shame. So moving on to the intergenerational cycle of incarceration and relational trauma. So one of the statistics indicates that children of incarcerated parents are on average 6 times more likely to become incarcerated themselves. This is extremely jarring for the kids because these kids are going to grow up and become adults and form couple relationships and have children of their own. So this is a very vicious cycle. And there are some bullet points. Of course, they don't, show the entire, complexity and interplay of different things, but at least to kind of put them all together is the justice system policy and implications. So where the parent is, how far the parent is incarcerated from the child, and how does that look like? So Chris is going to talk a little bit about that, like just the amount of work that the family has to put in just to see their loved ones. Low educational attainment, so those internalized and externalized feelings and behaviors get misconstrued by teachers and other members in the community who are not trained or understanding of what's going on in the child's life. It, of course, restricted economic resources. It then kind of, translates into the racial, social class differences that are impacting our children's outcomes, residential instability and neighborhood violence, especially if the kid is involved in the foster care system and constantly changing their environment, which then eventually leads to substance abuse, which, it depends on how you look at it, whether you look at it as a coping mechanism or, just substance abuse, and then their introduction to the child criminal involvement. And then again, it sort of ties back into where they are in the moment and how much support they are receiving in the environment that they are. Of course, homelessness is also very common amongst these children, and this is why we need appropriate assessment tools and appropriate treatment at the appropriate time to get these children and these families so they can have a better re-entry to the community. So I'm going to introduce Christopher to kind of walk you through the assessment and the treatment.
Good afternoon. So as a master's level clinician, I was working at a detention center in Newark where we would provide family services for the incarcerated residents. This was an all-adult male facility. The problem was during our therapeutic visitations, we found that the experience of being in the visitation was really stressful for the families. And this is corroborated by the existing literature. We know that visitations tend to be uninviting and don't facilitate normative family interactions. They're noisy, they lack privacy, and are essentially designed to control the movement of offenders and their families. So this has been shown to have a significant impact on our ability to provide treatment, to address the relational needs of children and families and their incarcerated partners as well. So what we tried to do is create more of a family-friendly environment for these individuals as they came in. So we would oftentimes hear experiences of invasive searches by security staff or being talked down to and essentially treated like criminals, right? So by the time the family comes in, it's difficult for us to work with them, build trust and rapport. So based off of one study, they found that parents' reports of trauma-based symptoms among children are mediated by the quality of the visitation experience. So again, as I mentioned, that really corroborates and underscores the need for us to be able to create that environment for them. So with regard to getting an accurate assessment of what the relational dynamics are among couples and families who are justice involved, it really requires for us to explore our own clinical biases. So being the only white person in the facility among the employees, but also there's a predominantly Black and Latino population that I was working with, having to sort of reflect on what are my own assumptions about what I think would be helpful with regard to trauma-informed care. So that became a really important consideration for me. And also developing a contextual understanding for what led to their incarceration experience as well. I think a lot of folks who are incarcerated are used to being judged and looked down on, so being able to build an alliance with them in that process that's non-judgmental or presumptive can go a really long way. Obviously, conducting a thorough biopsychosocial history is really important when we're working with a couple to gather that information. What do their trauma-based symptoms look like, right? What clusters are predominating? And also emphasizing and identifying what those support systems are in their community and what their existing strengths are. And that could also be strengths, not just individual strengths, but what's keeping the relationship intact, what's keeping the family cohesion in place, if at all. So what we did was we would have our therapeutic visitation experience where we would do groups with the family members, but we would also have couple sessions and family sessions once a week. And so oftentimes we would have them in both of our programs. So that gave us an opportunity to assess the relational functioning, both in sort of a naturalistic setting during visitation, but also in our couple sessions, or family sessions. And so once we were able to identify what the goals were, whether that was co-parenting, or if the couple was together, addressing issues of distrust from past infidelity or substance abuse or domestic violence, that's when we were really able to identify the very mechanisms that maintain the cycle of conflict within the relationship. So what were the prior traumatic experience I may have had in their past, and how might that be playing itself out in the relationship between the incarcerated individual and their partner or their family member, or their child. So with regard to treatment phases, one of the important things right off the bat is to establish the context for change and to instill a sense of safety and stabilization within the family. So that was ultimately characterized by providing psychoeducation on what trauma symptoms were, what PTSD looks like, complex PTSD, acute stress, and so on. And also, if they had a child, helping the parents, giving the parents direct information about what those behaviors might mean, if they're exhibiting problem behaviors in school, bedwetting, acting out, things like that, helping them understand why that might be happening. If they have a loved one, a father or mother who's incarcerated, and trying to adapt to those changes. So helping them understand that, but also each other's enactments that are playing out in the room, helping them understand why that might be happening based off of our history that we gather, based off of their traumatic experiences. So that really instills a sense of empathy and compassion in the therapeutic space, where some real great work can be done. So within the prison systems, for some people, that establishing a context for change could actually be beneficial. Some people report that they needed that routine to be able to attend to their own needs with regard to self-care. So that was something that we would also do. So the second phase, reflection on trauma narratives, involves sharing original perspectives of the childhood trauma experiences while restoring the narratives with a focus on resiliency and adaptation. So it's based off of narrative therapy approaches, and it's ultimately recommended that we promote reflective sharing over full affective re-experiencing, especially in light of the prison context. So, depending on the culture, the individual and the family may devalue the idea of full affective expression and may prefer, containing, being able to contain one's emotions. So, with regard to being culturally appropriate, culturally responsive, and contextually appropriate, it's helpful to be able to kind of go along with it, with whatever they feel like is important at that time. So reflecting on the trauma narratives, but then also reframing them. So with regard to race, class, gender, and religion, that the intersection of those identities oftentimes played a substantial role in how they understood their trauma. So once they've been able to kind of reflect on maybe why they may have those interactions that could be problematic, whether that was past substance abuse, lying, cheating, domestic violence, they can start to think about, gain insight on why that might be the case, where that behavior originated from, and then start to think differently about, for instance, what it means to be a man, right? Maybe all of these things stemmed from, experiences of abandonment, loss, and so to think about confronting those feelings of abandonment and talking about what it means to be there consistently for your family, and face those feelings of abandonment head on. So with stage 3, at this point, a lot of couples that I've noticed were eager to try out these new skills on the outside. Unfortunately, because they're locked up, it was really difficult for them to be able to put it into practice depending on when they were going to be released. So what I'd encourage is to continue to try to implement these principles through letter writing, phone calls, and ongoing couple sessions if necessary. So it was really about sort of summarizing and consolidating these new perspectives to help them along the way. So the last thing I just want to touch on briefly is the role of psychologists, not just psychologists, but also master's level clinicians, because that's when I was actually working in this context, with regard to social justice and advocacy. So it's been my experience, and I don't know how many here have worked in the detention centers, but oftentimes the great work that we do in the therapy room can unravel once they get back on the unit because of the ongoing experiences of stress, trauma, re-traumatization. So building alliances with security staff becomes critical in this respect. And one of the ways that we can do that is by giving credence to the integral role that they do play, and helping them understand that we do respect what they do, given the high-risk nature of the work. Also framing mental health access as a safety issue. So they revoked visitations on one weekend and the prisoners went on hunger strike. And so that became a safety issue. So trying to help them understand that the more access that they have, not just to mental health, but their loved ones, the more secure and safe the facility can be. So we're aligning our goals, because oftentimes our goals seemed in direct opposition to each other. But if we can reframe it in a way where we're kind of both coming from the same perspective, it could go a long way. And then attending cultural differences. So as I mentioned before, my educational level and also race and class became an issue with regards to the relationship between me and security staff. So trying to kind of see things from their perspective and what they thought was really important, especially since I was not from the community that the detention center was housed, where most of the employees were. So really trying to kind of find informal spaces for me to develop relationships with them and help us learn about kind of their own experience was one way that we were able to kind of build those alliances. I think after the trust is there, training and education is important to promote, not just with security staff, but other clinicians, nurses, etc. So educating individuals about the biological, psychological, and behavioral impact of trauma incarceration, And prisoner-informed consent and respecting the rights and dignity of prisoners. So routine pat-downs, for instance, after visitations. You know, a lot of prisoners have experienced past sexual abuse, physical abuse, things like that. And so when they react during a routine pat-down, all of that context is stripped away, oftentimes. And then they're maybe sanctioned even further. So trying to help them understand that maybe if you tell them or explain to them before what exactly you're going to do before you do it, that can also be one way to promote sort of, more, at the very least, less traumatizing experience. And also, you know, again, as I mentioned, creating a welcome environment for children and families. So we tried to work hard with security staff to make sure that when the family member was there, that the resident, the incarcerated loved one was alerted as soon as possible so that they can come down and get the most out of their visit. Things like that. The routine patterns, we would have ongoing conversations, or I would observe their experience of visitation. So we got to a point with security staff where we can actually observe, take notes, and even provide feedback. Now it's questionable how much feedback that they actually took in from our observations, but at least it led us into the room, and I think that's big. So yeah, ultimately, I guess the big takeaway is, for me, in thinking about this, is how do we affect systems beyond the therapy room, especially if we're working within the context of a correctional facility, so that the incarcerated individuals, their family member, or children that they bring into the facility can be taken care of across all situations. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for questions, and Martha Hernandez, thank you for your presentation. I'll mention the Division 43 website. If you go to the website of Division 43, the Society for Couple and Family Psychology, and if you click on the Diversity tab, if you scroll down to Social Justice Initiative and click on the Social Justice Initiative, you'll see the different projects we've been working on. One is on immigration laws and families, another one is on incarceration and families. You will find resources. We've started working on gathering resources for clinicians as well as families, individuals, and couples that might be helpful to you as clinicians as you're working with incarcerated families that are involved in the criminal justice system. So I encourage you to go visit our websites to find more resources about those two topics. We also are in the process of creating webinars, so if you want to learn more about the topic and you want to educate yourself, you're thinking that you might be working with families that are immigrating to this country, either documented or undocumented, and Martha is working on, has already recorded 2 webinars that we're about to launch, and do you want to talk a little bit about this, the webinars, and that way people know?
So the webinars are really kind of a series. One of the things that I found is I work and interact with lawyers, immigration lawyers on a regular basis. Part of it is what can we do to educate them. So many times clients come in and tell me that they're re-traumatized when having to tell the story to the lawyer. And that can be really difficult. So educating the lawyers. And so what I'm hoping to do with the webinars is that there are a lot of psychologists and clinicians that are doing immigration evaluations without getting training. And there's a couple of reasons for that, is that there isn't a ton of training out there. There's no standardized way of doing it. And this is stuff that there's a few of us kind of in the field. I know some individuals from Division 45 that are really active, and some of the other divisions as well, in creating and standardizing how these evaluations are conducted. And so what my hope is, and if you all are interested, is that each webinar will teach how to do an assessment, or give you like a quick rundown on how to do an assessment on each different type of evaluation. So you heard me say U visa. A U visa is for individuals who have been a victim of crime. They themselves are undocumented, and the government says, okay, you were a victim of crime, you called the cops, and we are going to try to repay you for doing that by giving you a visa to be able to stay in the U.S. But that can take 7 years, at least in California. And there's a bunch of others, so like if you have a family that's of mixed status or a couple that's of mixed status, then you can ask for a waiver. So where the U.S. citizen will say, you know, is I'm going to be impacted if my partner has to leave. And so you do the assessment on the U.S. citizen. And so my hope is each of those evaluations has to be tailored in a specific way, that the webinars can address each of those types of evaluations on a basis so that all of you can learn, and it's just a small snippet. Obviously, there's a lot more training that needs to be done. I'm also working with the student on potentially standardizing and interviewing other psychologists that have done immigration evaluations and how to standardize the evaluation process as well. So, open up to questions.
I have a question specifically for you. I've done most of my graduate training in the being licensed. I've worked in colleges and university settings. And one of the things that we have tried to do at the clinic that I worked at was create a support group for undocumented students. And unfortunately, we actually tried to do that on 2 different semesters, and they never took it. And talking with colleagues at other colleges and universities, it's a hard route to get going. And I'm asking you if there's any insights, suggestions you may have on how to better maybe reach that population so support groups, community healing can start happening on college campus.
Yeah. Can you tell me what's your largest undocumented population?
10.
Okay. So you want to know your population, right? One of the things that I found is being creative in maybe not calling it a support group.
Yeah, we played with the name because the first time it was we have a on-campus department that works with undocumented students. So we connected with them, tried to go down that road. It's a lot of roadblocks.
I do think it's a difficult population to reach. Number one, there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of barriers that they face on a regular basis. Some of the things that, in connection to others, because I don't work in a university necessarily, but what we've done or what I've heard others do is that they've created very unique names for some of the things that they're doing, or they'll go to them. So we have a barbershop talk. San Jose State goes into a barbershop and has a barbershop talk for men of color. We've done, pairing up with the other organizations that might work with that population, creating, and it starts from the day that they start at that university. So universities will put together a, collaborative, you can kind of make it a fancy name or whatever, like the welcome gala or come and meet everyone. It's the sense of community, and if you get them early on, they're more likely to then be engaged in those, and you might already have those.
One thing, I'm just saying, stop at this, so don't think of questions, but we did healing circles, and we teamed up with the social justice department on campus, and those were really successful for a myriad of other issues, social political issues that would come up, and that was, I think, almost a better way to do that.
Also, if basic needs aren't met, it's going to be so much harder for anybody to then come in for psychological services. So college students always like food, right? Who can't use food? And you're also meeting a very basic need that some individuals may not have the financial resources to be able to have a dinner, right? So finding those resources as well and how to engage them in these ways.
I have 2 questions. I've been out to the Clint Child Detention Facility several times now near El Paso, and I have 2 questions. The first one is, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, but I'm just wondering if those of us who are mandated reporters, if there has ever been a precedent for us to call Child Protective Services en masse, because we know there's enough documentation in the media now that what's happening to children is abusive by the government. I see pros and cons to this because we need Child Protective Services to be a functioning system, and if we were to if I had a magic wand and all of us called in at the same time, they would be totally overwhelmed. And so there would be a number of other children who would not be able to get the supervision, the insight that is needed. So that's the first question. The second question is, having gone to the Annunciation House which is one of the emergency shelters. So when Border Patrol calls up and they're like, this corner on this time, we're going to drop off this many people, the nonprofits swoop in and pick them up and get them off the street and then help people get to sponsors before the Migrant Protection Program. So my thought was, well, for those of us psychologists, social workers, nurses who have practicum placements as part of our training program, would it not be helpful for us to put a letter, a word out to all of the faculty who are doing that kind of work to say, hey, encourage your students to connect with a local immigrant rights advocacy center, because these students may not have money to be donating to legal funds. They may not be able to just get up and go down to the border, and maybe that's not what's most helpful based on the psychosocial needs that people have once they get to the sponsor. So quickly, your thoughts on those two ideas, please.
Okay. So I would say for the latter kind of conversation starter, what we've done is obviously I also understand that California is a little bit different, but we've paired up with the Palo Alto Police Department, and they have been very, very helpful to us. They have promised to not help Homeland Security unless somebody has a warrant. And so they alert us when things are happening, and then we then will disseminate that information. A lot of times we then go into the community. So Santa Clara Psych Association has a lot of training, and we go into churches. We go into, and this is what I mean by meeting them where they're at, because it is harder, the fear of just leaving their homes or the fear of going somewhere else, and what might happen if I go out is very real. And the truth is, I've had clients show up and say there was a Homeland Security on my way here. And so not only am I having to deal with their depression and their PTSD, I'm then having to deal with the crisis at hand, right, of the fear of just coming to my office and how scary that is. So taking services to them has been the biggest thing, disseminating information to as many people as you can, and then you have to be strategic about it. Because if that information gets to the wrong person, right, we've had plenty of cases that are documented where Homeland Security and ICE have been outside of courthouses. And so if you're even afraid to just show up to court, where you're hoping to get some of, your immigration court status, then that makes it really difficult as well. And remind me your first question. Child abuse.
Maybe if we called CPS. I mean, it's different. It's different than having someone sitting in my office saying, this is an identifiable victim who is underage and this kind of stuff. Nobody knows who all the kids are that are in detention. So to some extent, structurally, there's no way we would know who the identifiable victims are, but we know that they're being victimized.
Right. And I do think that that's a bigger systemic issue of how do we advocate for what's happening in those detention centers. I don't think that, and I personally will use myself, I don't think I've done enough to be able to say, are we really thinking about what's happening in those detention centers? I know that it's in the media day in and day out, cases of child abuse, neglect, separation, and how traumatizing that can be. Are we advocating, are we going to the Hill as psychologists, as clinicians, are we looking at the bigger systemic issue? And I would say that, unfortunately, we can't file a CPS report on an entire agency when we don't have, identifiable clients, and we're outside of our realm. So, but if you're in the detention center and you find one person that has been, then you can file a CPS report. I think it's more of how do we rally together for more of the social justice piece of it and really make change on a systemic level.
Just to add to this, if you're interested in advocacy, Rosie Phillips, our current president, is this initiative on deep poverty, and what she's called for is action. She doesn't want people to write, she wants people to be out there and really act on those issues. So I was at a symposium earlier this afternoon where they were talking about advocacy and what we could do. I think if you go to the Deep Poverty Initiative, they must have a web page on the APA website. You'll probably find resources on how do you go to the Hill, how do you talk to your local officials that have been elected, right? Those you have elected, how do you go repeatedly and you advocate for those issues that are really important to address? So that might be a place to go for you as you learn to be advocates. Thank you very much. I think our time is up. And